So here we are once again in Microsoft Flight Simulator. This is the Sim Update 5 version of Microsoft Flight Simulator, i.e. the one that's the same as the Xbox version with the hotfix applied, so it's all running very nicely. And we're looking at another add-on aeroplane available for Microsoft Flight Simulator. This is the MScenery A10 Thunderbolt 2. Which is available from the in-sim marketplace, i.e. From within Microsoft Flight Simulator. It costs, I think it's about £12 sterling, maybe a little bit less. And for that, you get an A10 Thunderbolt 2 with one paint job and no manual. So this is a pretty basic add-on in terms of what you get. Literally one paint job, no manual whatsoever, but fortunately it's a relatively easy aeroplane to fly. So, is it any good? Well, straight off the bat, you can see that it's a pretty nice model of an A10 Thunderbolt. Very accurate. It looks like the real thing, with a couple of anomalies which we'll get to. But the most obvious thing that is different about a real A10 Thunderbolt and this A10 Thunderbolt that you get in the sim is that, according to the rules of Microsoft Flight Simulator, it being a civilian sim, anything that's sold on the in-game market, if it has weaponry on it, it has to be removed. Now, for the most part, that doesn't really matter with combat aeroplanes because it just means that they won't have weapons hanging off the pylons. But anyone who knows anything about the A10 Thunderbolt will know that it is basically built around one of the biggest guns in the world, which is the General Electric GAU-8 Avenger 7-barrel multi-barreled cannon that fires 30mm shells, which on the real A10 Thunderbolt protrudes a little bit out from the nose and is fairly large. Here's a picture of the GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon next to a Volkswagen Beetle. You can see how big this thing is. So the A10 is basically built around that gun. But of course they've had to remove it on this version that's sold in the Microsoft Flight Simulator store, and it looks a bit like a shark that's had its teeth pulled out without that gun. Can't blame the developer for that. They obviously did model the gun on the original model, because if you zoom the camera to the inside of the model, you can see the remains of the multi-barreled cannon on it. So if they get around to selling this on an exterior website other than the Microsoft Flight Sim built-in store, they might put the gun back on it. But at the moment, as far as I'm aware, you can only get this from the in-sim store. So that means that you're not having the Avenger cannon on the thing, which is a bit of a shame. But, like, as I say, rules is rules, and MScenery have had to follow that rule. But there is another bit of a visual glitch on this thing, which is something that occurred on the other MScenery add-on aeroplane that you can get for Microsoft Flight Simulator that I also reviewed on this channel, which is their A4 Skyhawk. If you saw my review of that, you'll see there's a few problems with the animations of the control surfaces, and one of the problems with the animation of the control surfaces on that A4 Skyhawk is also replicated on this thing, so it's indicative that the developer's got a bit of an issue with animations, and that is the ailerons. If you look very closely at the aileron, which I shall waggle for you there, you can see that they're not sitting in line with the wing. It's up a little bit on this side, and it's not because the ailerons are deflected over to one side, because if I swing the camera around, you can see that it's deflected up on this side as well. Now, initially, I thought that might have been because the speed brakes were partially deployed, because on the real A10 Thunderbolt, the ailerons split to act as spoilers. The top half moves up and the bottom half moves down, but that's not animated on this. The speed brakes don't work on this model, so it is just a glitch that both ailerons are slightly tilted up. Bit of a shame that. There are some other visual glitches which we'll see as we progress, but they need to fix that. They need to fix that on their A4 Skyhawk as well. On the A4 Skyhawk, if you watch my review, there is another visual glitch with that, where one of the leading edge slats, as it deploys, it moves sideways a little bit. That's another thing that they need to sort out. Watch that review on this channel if you want to check that out. Anyway, as I say, you only get one livery with this thing, and it's a bit of a kind of weird hybrid between the Air Force Grey that A10 Thunderbolts used to be quite commonly painted in, and the sort of olive drab colour that a lot of them are painted in these days. But it's a very shiny surface, so I wouldn't say it was a particularly accurate paint job, but I don't mind it that much. It's a little bit on the shiny side for my liking, but it's okay. Other than that, I would say that the exterior model's pretty good. If we take a close look at it, I'll just switch to another camera. You can see that there's a lot of detail on there. There's that little pod hanging down off the right hand side, and you can see that the landing gear is very accurate, and the panel layouts and canopy and all that kind of stuff is pretty good. So it's a nice model overall. I think it's pretty good. Paint, as I say, paint job, bit shiny for my liking, but I can live with it. And I'm never too critical of paint jobs on add-ons for Flight Simulator because, you know, it's fairly easy to repaint them. So it's not the end of the world. Anyway, let's have a look at the inside of the thing. So inside the cockpit, you can see that this is actually a pretty accurate model of an A10 cockpit. It's got the ACES ejector seat there, and the panel is pretty much like the real thing if you look at photographs of an A10 Thunderbolt. However, there is something to know. The A10 Thunderbolt, the original version of the A10 Thunderbolt, first flight 1972, and obviously that was the A10 Thunderbolt A, and the Thunderbolt A, the first variant of it, had a cockpit that looks very, very similar to this, i.e. traditional round gauges, not much in the way of sort of like CRTs or anything like that. Current A10 Thunderbolts, if you look at an A10 Thunderbolt these days, they've been upgraded and they have glass panels in them, primary flight displays and all that kind of stuff. So this is why you can tell this is an A10A, one of the kind of originals, rather than what you see these days. Not the end of the world because you know, it's not like you're going to be firing weapons. The only sort of CRT that you find in the A10A is this thing here, which, if I remember correctly, is the screen that you use for sort of, it's got like a TV camera on it where you can zoom the view from TV-guided Maverick missiles, and you can move the cursor to lock onto things and guide the missiles and stuff like that. I think it can also display stores and a few other bits and pieces on there, but that's what that does. So obviously it's not doing much in the sim. Now on the face of it, this looks like it's going to be a pretty exciting and detailed cockpit, but I have to say that most of these switches are just for show. Some of them operate in the sense that you can actually move them, you know, you can select them and what have you, but they don't actually do very much in the sim. So I would say that probably about maybe half the switches in this cockpit are actually operable in terms of you can move them, but it's probably a significantly smaller number of those that actually do stuff. So if you look, for example, you can see that when I'm getting my mouse over there, the COM2 radio frequency swap and stuff like that is operating, and then when we move here, you can see the speed brake emergency switch there, and the elevator emergency and the aileron emergency switch, but they're not really doing that much in the sim. So, you know, you can flick these switches, but, you know, it's not really going to achieve much to do that. Moving up forward on this panel, you've got all of the engine start stuff and the fuel tank stuff there. Most of that does actually work. You can start the engine on this realistically if you want to. A slightly disappointing thing, which was also true of their A4 Skyhawk, is you can't open the canopy. There is a switch to open the canopy, which is also repeated on the other side of the cockpit, but sadly you can't open the canopy. If we move up to the panel here, you can see that you've got a lot of gauges, and you've got, and oddly enough, even though you can't have that weapon displaying in the sim, you can still have this dirty great big panel where you can change the rate of fire of the gun even though the gun's removed, and it shows how many rounds are remaining. So it's a little bit anachronous that they've removed the gun, but you've still got this dirty great big panel saying that it has got a gun on it, but obviously it's not going to do very much. There are some switches that work on here even though it's not really going to do much. You can see that you can change the fusing on weaponry and stuff like that, and you know, you can turn the landing lights on and things like that, but you know, the light switches work, but none of this gun stuff's going to work. As a slightly bad point about things that don't work in this cockpit is that you can see there, there's some controls for the hood, and there's this up front control panel and stuff for the hood here. But the head-up display doesn't actually work. You can't have anything displaying on it. Now, that would be fair enough if it was the gun reticule that wasn't working. You could kind of understand that. But normally down on the head-up display of things like the A10 Thunderbolt, you've got kind of airspeed down one side and altitude down the other side. And we've got no means to read the airspeed or the altitude off this head-up display, which is why I am using this thing, this Shift plus Z add-on up here, which is available from flightsim.to, which replicates the Shift Z function that was in FSX and P3D and FS 2004 and stuff like that. So I can read the airspeed and altitude off this thing here in lieu of me not having a HUD, but it's a bit bad that it's not on the head-up display. There are some other problems with these instruments as well. We'll see that when we get in the air, but I will point out for you to look out for. One of them is there is a traditional airspeed indicator there, noted in knots and what have you. You'll note that when we're flying along, this is not displaying the airspeed accurately. We've got an artificial horizon here. That does, you'll see when we start the engine up, that does spin up and level off and what have you. However, look out for a bit of bizarre behaviour from this when we actually start flying around. More when we get to it, it's got a problem. Then of course we've got sort of like engine gauges and altimeter and vertical speed indicator and what have you, and most of that stuff works as you'd expect. Fuel gauges, hydraulic gauges, and all these engine gauges do spin up and stuff like that. Don't know how accurately they reflect the real engines as they would be on the A10 Thunderbolt. They're TF34s, I think. That's the military version of the CF34 that you find on the CRJ, if I remember rightly. Anyway, carrying on down here, there are a lot of sort of warning lights on here. Not a lot of this actually functions as it would on the real aeroplane. This stuff here for the power actually works, and then there is some stuff down here that works as well for bleed air and things like that, and main air supply. So you, as I say, you can actually crank this thing more or less like the real thing if you want to. You can also start it with Control plus E, but what I will do is I will start it using the controls in the cockpit. So we're going to get battery power on there, and we're going to get APU on there, and we're going to get the AC generator on there, and then we're going to come over this side of the panel, and I will move over the panel a little bit, and then what we'll do is we'll get all of the fuel tanks and cross feeds and booster pumps operating by flicking all these switches up. Booster pumps and stuff like that, and then we'll get the APU start on there, and then fuel flow, we'll get that up, and then these two will start the engine. So here we go. So you should be able to hear the engine sort of cranking up, and you know, eventually what's going to happen when the engine spins up is we're going to get these gauges lighting up. But if we go to the exterior view, you'll see that the engine is going through startup sequence, and now it's picking up and igniting, and it should be sort of, the engine sound should be sort of going up in pitch until it goes self-sustaining and what have you. So the engine start sequence is, there we go, is pretty realistic. If we go back in the cockpit and we start the other engine, which was that one, and we go on the external view, you can see that one's cranking up as well. So the engine animation and the way it starts up is reasonably okay. The engine sound itself, now it's a TF34, which is the, as I say, it's the military version of the CF34, which is a jet engine that you do find on some airliners. As I say, you find it on the CRJ, and I think you find it on the, if I remember rightly, it's on the Embraer E-jets, you know, like the Embraer 175 and the 195 and stuff like that. So I think what they've done is they've just used a sort of generic jet airliner engine noise, and it works pretty well. It's okay, you know what I mean? So it sounds quite a lot like the A10 Thunderbolt, if not exactly. I don't imagine that they've actually gone out and recorded a real A10 Thunderbolt. Now, back to some of the issues. Now, you can see that the artificial horizon has spun up, but when we get in the air and we start flying around, watch how that operates. It actually tilts the wrong way. So it's a bit like some weird Eastern European artificial horizons that function like that, but it's incorrect for an A10 Thunderbolt. Now, if we go on the exterior view, can you see that I've just turned the lights on, but you can see that the red light for the wingtip there is actually below the aircraft. It's ever so slightly below the wing. Can you see that? And the same is true for the green nav light on the other side. They're a little bit out of position. They should be where that thing is on the wingtip. So that's a bit cack. And when I push this back, you'll notice another anomaly on this as well, which is if you look at the animations for the wheels they're spinning round in the wrong direction and not going at the correct speed when we push back. I'll show you that. Look at the wheels when we push back. Can you see that? Have a look again if you missed it. So the wheel animation isn't that great, and the nose wheel is not animated at all. So when you operate the steering, the nose wheel isn't turning and what have you. But even if it was actually turning, this thing's actually quite difficult to steer. It's not got a great turning circle. You'll find that what you have to do is you have to use either a bit of differential thrust on the engines, or you have to use toe brakes and rudders and stuff like that and what have you. I'm using Satec rudder pedals here to operate this. If we have a look at the controls when I do that, so here we go. Bit of right rudder input, you can see the rudder pedal moving. Bit of left rudder input, you can see the left rudder pedal moving. I don't know whether it's actually doing the sort of toe brake movements, but I'm applying a little bit of left toe brake there. And then when it comes to the control surfaces, yes, the throttle is animated in the cockpit, and yes, the joystick is animated. That's another weird thing about this. The elevator is not particularly sensitive on this, and so what you find is that you do actually have to give it quite a lot of nose-up elevator trim to get it moving. Anyway, let's try and get this thing to the runway. As I say, it does not turn very well, so I'm going to give it a little bit of power. I'm going to give it full right rudder. And you can probably tell from the way this is sort of jerking around, I'm nudging it round by giving it stabs of the right toe brake, which means that it can be kind of difficult to turn this thing. If we have a look on the exterior view, I'll give it full rudder and you'll notice that the nose wheel doesn't turn. There's the full rudder input, you can see it turning, but the nose wheel isn't turning, or at least isn't animating. So what you can tell from that, you can see this thing's getting good frame rates though. I've got 30.2 there, and we have definitely got AI on, because you can see an aeroplane there, which looks like it might be going around there. You can see an aeroplane there, and you know, when we go on the external view, you can see that I have actually got aeroplanes on the stand. The airport that I'm at here, by the way, I've got, as I say, this is Sim Update 5 with a hot fix, which is the same version that was souped up to release on the Xbox. And I've got most of the graphics turned up, and the airport that we're at is the Payware Macca Sims Echo Golf Charlie Charlie. That's Manchester Airport in the UK, and very nice it is too, and very inexpensive. I recommend that one. Sim Update 5, if you're curious about it, runs pretty well, and this thing gets reasonably good frame rates. If you're curious about what machine I'm running this on, the CPU, the main processor, is an Intel i5. That's the Kaby Lake version, so quite an old processor. The GPU is an ATI Radeon RX 480, so again, that's quite an old GPU. That's got 8 gigabytes of DDR5 RAM on it, so you know, it's quite well endowed for being an old one. The main board is an Asus Z270P, so quite an old main board. It's got 44 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM on it. So this is, you know, yeah, it's an okay computer, but it's an old computer, and it's running Flight Simulator fairly well. There you go. You can see frames per second 30.7 at a Payware airport, with most of the graphics turned up pretty high. So let's get this thing in the air. Now, you'll note that because the wind is blowing down the runway, the airspeed indicator is already indicating that we're getting 6.9 knots, which indicates that the pitot tube is working on this thing, because I thought when the airspeed indicator was working a bit iffily on this thing, I thought, have I got a pitot cover on it or something like that, or maybe not turn the pitot heat on, but not so. Now, two things to watch out for here. Watch the airspeed indicator. That would be 100 knots. So it should be about there when we're rotating for takeoff. Note that it doesn't move very much. Also note that when I put this into a bank, that the artificial horizon goes the wrong way. The altimeter will work. You can see the engine gauges are working because I've just given it a bit of throttle there, and you can see that that's moving and what have you, and the clock works and what have you. But gauges wise, airspeed indicator, artificial horizon, a bit iffy, and I'm having to rely on this thing here to read the airspeed indicator. I could use that for the altitude, but I would prefer a digital readout like the HUD, so I'm going to use the altitude up there. I'm going to give it one stage of flaps. That is an animation that does actually work on this thing. So here we go, one stage of flaps, and you should see those things coming down, and you can see that. There you go. Now another animation that's a bit and was like that, and I should say is like that on their MScenery A4 Skyhawk as well, is that the actual mechanics of the gear retraction animation are correct, but the speed at which they retract is incredibly quick. I'll take you on the external view when I'm retracting the gear, and you'll see the gear comes up, and it's nicely animated, but it comes up really quick. There's another weird thing about to watch out for on this. It takes a lot of speed to get this thing off the ground. Bear in mind, this is being depicted with no weaponry hanging off the wingtips, and fuel-wise, I only have half fuel on there, and you can see there that we're getting, like these sort of warnings. So I've only got half fuel on there, and this thing is still quite difficult to get off the deck. Watch the airspeed. I suspect this thing won't get off the deck until we've passed at least 150 knots indicated airspeed. And what happens with it, you'll notice this, is that it's not flying, and then all of a sudden it flies. So the flight model's a bit, Anyway, let's shut up and get this thing in the air. So, throttling up, and then full throttle, and it tracks pretty straight along the runway. You might have to give it a little bit of rudder to keep it going, but not a great deal. Now at this point we're hitting about 80 knots, and it should start getting kind of if it was the real thing, it should start getting pretty light on the wheels. But I could give it full back on the stick, and it's not doing anything. And now we're getting to 145 knots, and I'm fully back on the stick, and then all of a sudden it's in the air. So it kind of snatches into the air, which is a little bit weird. I go on the external view, I hit the gear. Did you see how fast the gear came up? It was like, whoa, and the gear's up. Now, I'm having to give it a fair bit of nose up trim here to keep this thing flying. But you can see it goes along at a fair old clip. I'm doing, according to that, up at the top left, I'm doing about 255 knots. Now at 255 knots, the A10 Thunderbolt should have quite a snappy roll rate. But this thing is a little bit lethargic in roll rate. I'll just show you that. I'm going to full throttle on. That's a full aileron deflection, and that is a little bit slow. And I had to kind of pull it up a little bit out of there. So that, I'm not particularly convinced by it. The elevator doesn't seem particularly effective. I've got pretty much full rudder deflection on there, and almost full hard back on the elevator, and this thing is not turning. Now you might think, well, Al, you are going pretty fast there, but this thing, if you start dropping down below about 200 knots, it starts getting very, very loose on the controls and what have you. So flight model wise, not the best, shall we say. And I could sort of forgive that if the head-up display worked, because one of the things that you might like to do with something like an A10 Thunderbolt, perhaps not in this weather where it's a little bit murky, but that would be to fly a low level, dodging between trees and stuff like that. And it's a little bit tricky to do that without a head-up display. You have to go sort of purely visually to do that. But it is kind of fun to blast this thing around at low level, in spite of those kind of handling difficulties and what have you. And as I say, it is quite a nice model, so it looks pretty good in the air. You see what I mean about that slightly lethargic roll rate. I'll go on the external view and I'll give a full pull up on the elevators and then a full push down, so you can see how slow the elevator rate is on it. Here we go. Pull up. Pull down. Bit lazy on the elevators, shall we say. Right, so I'm coming back on the throttle. Now at this point it would be great if we could deploy the speed brakes and have those ailerons split to slow us down, but we can't do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it full flaps. I'm going to drop the gear down and hopefully all that will be coming down, which it appears it is. And we'll see if we can bring this thing in for a landing. So there we go, there's 2-3 right, which we're sort of reasonably well lined up on at Manchester. And we'll bring this in. Now, I wouldn't like to get this much slower than about 140 knots on approach, because it starts getting really loose on the controls, and you've already seen that even at like fairly high speeds you can give it a lot of elevator deflection and it's, you know, a bit slow to react. So, you know, I think you're going to have to, with this thing, come in slightly hot as opposed to what you might do on the real thing. There we are, coming in. And if you watch real A10 Thunderbolts come in for a landing, what pilots typically tend to do is the moment they touch down, they open the speed brakes to split the ailerons to use a bit of aerodynamic braking, but of course we can't do this on this thing. Sort of weird in that, you know, like the elevators aren't particularly effective, but they are twitchy. I'm just going to have to let the speed bleed off and let it sort of sink onto the runway here. And there we go, with things down. So I'm giving it full wheel brakes here to come to a halt. So I don't think you're going to be getting this thing down on really, really short runways. The runway at Manchester, 2 miles long, which they actually needed today because there was a Jet 2 737 that made an emergency landing there today. It had a hydraulic failure on the left engine. Good job by the pilots and by the emergency crews at the airport in turning that into sort of a complete non-event, really. You know, very, very impressive. So well done to those Jet 2 pilots who got that thing down with one engine. Very cool. As you can see here, now I'm stabbing the brakes a lot to get this thing round, which I don't think you'd have to do on the real thing. You know, I think the real thing would probably just get round on the nose wheel. Alright, so we'll get the flaps up. And you can see those flaps are coming up. And you can still see that we've got that ailerons tilted up going on there. So, what do we think about this thing? Well, you know, it's not very expensive. It's 12 quid. But, you know, there are a few problems with it, as we've seen. If they sorted those out, I'd say it was okay. If you're desperate for an A10 Thunderbolt, you do your Microsoft Flight Simulator, you know, it's okay. But it would be better if they sorted out those issues. But if you want a realistic A10 Thunderbolt, my personal recommendation would be to take a look at the Combat Simulator DCS World and have a look at the add-on A10 Thunderbolt for that, because that is absolutely amazing, completely realistic. Now, as we taxi in common with most of the Chocks Hangers videos, a little bit about the real aeroplane if you're not familiar with the A10 Thunderbolt. So, in the Vietnam War, the US forces found that their aeroplanes, their jet fighters, were a bit too fast to be used for ground attack missions. So what they ended up having to use was a Korean War era aeroplane that had been developed just after the end of the Second World War, and that was the Douglas A-1E Skyraider, which was very, very good for ground attack, but quite vulnerable to ground fire, but it could carry a lot of weaponry. And so what they did in 1967 was they started something called the AX program, which was to investigate the possibility of making a dedicated ground attack jet. And interestingly, what they did for that was they made everybody on the AX program read Hans Ulrich Rudel's biography. And Hans Ulrich Rudel, if you've not heard of him, he was a Stuka pilot in World War II that was incredibly successful. Everyone on the AX program had to read his autobiography, despite the fact that he was like a really horrible Nazi. And he really was, quite unrepentant after the end of the Second World War. So anyway, on the AX program, what they looked at was the Henschel HS-129, which was a twin-engine German ground attack anti-tank plane from World War II. They looked at the Ilyushin IL-2 Sturmovik, which was a Russian ground attack plane, incredibly tough. They used to call that the cement bomber, it was so tough. And they also looked at the A-1 Skyraider, and what they did was they issued a set of stats based on the best points of those airplanes, and invited aircraft manufacturers to submit designs. Excuse me. Of which Northrop submitted a design. Excuse me. And Fairchild Republic submitted a design. So the Northrop design was designated the YA9, and the Fairchild design was designated the YA10. No prizes for guessing which one won. But if you look at a picture of the Northrop YA9, and then you have a look at the Russian sort of A10 equivalent, which is the Sukhoi Su-25 front foot, you'll notice a lot of similarities between the Su-25 front foot and the Northrop YA9 prototype. So it's quite interesting to see that. You just kind of wonder whether there was a bit of espionage involved there, because it does look very, very similar. But anyway, the US selected the Fairchild Republic prototype, which is the YA9, which then became the A10, and Fairchild thought that the Canopy looked a bit like the P-47 Thunderbolt that they'd made in World War II, which was a pretty successful ground attack fighter, and so they called it the Thunderbolt 2, but of course lots of people call it the Warthog these days. So, the prototype made its first flight in 1972, and it was first deployed in 1976. And one of the interesting things that they found with it is that that on the prototype, when they were firing that big GAU-8 Avenger cannon, what they found was that the recoil actually slowed the plane down quite considerably, because the recoil from the gun is actually outputs more power than one of the engines, so it slows it down quite a few miles an hour when you fire the gun. But the other problem that they found with it was that the gases ejected from the gun could actually drift back, go into the engine intakes, and make the engine stall. That bus appeared from nowhere there, and actually make the engine stall. So they put a bit of a shroud around the gun, which you see on A10 Thunderbolts, and they recommended that you only fire short bursts with the GAU Avenger, which is all you really need to do, because that fires depleted uranium 30mm cannon shells. I've got one of those, and it's flipping enormous. It's about a foot long, 30mm diameter from the projectile. It's a huge thing. I use it as a paperweight. So you only, if you're attacking a tank from above where the armour isn't very, very strong, you only need 2 or 3 rounds to destroy a tank. So not a problem. However, there is an interesting thing with the A10 Thunderbolt, which you might not know, and that is when you press the gun trigger on the thing, the igniters for the engine, which are used for the start procedure, actually come on to keep the engine going, just in case some gases from the gun go into the engine and prevent it from stalling. So yeah, first flight 72, went into service in 1976, and they built about 800 of them, but they've sort of like revamped it and what have you. So this is an A10A. This is kind of like one of the ones that went into service in '76. But the A10C is the one with the glass panels on, and it's had sort of like the wings strengthened and all that kind of stuff. And last fun fact, GAU-8 Avenger, which you saw a picture of, the barrels on that gun are 2.3 meters long, so it's massive, and it can fire at an incredible rate of fire of 3,900 rounds per minute. Just think about how many cannon shells that's coming out of the thing. So it's no wonder that the A10 Thunderbolt is an incredibly impressive plane, and to the extent that the US are extending the lifetime of the A10 Thunderbolt because there just isn't anything suitable to replace it. They've got like the F-35 and stuff like that, but it's like, you know, just not a patch on what an A10 Thunderbolt 2 can do. So it's a hugely impressive plane, but some glitches on this thing. So just be aware of them that I've pointed out. If you're prepared to put up with them, then fantastic. You know, for 12 quid, it's okay. If, on the other hand, you want a fully realistic A10 Thunderbolt, have a look at DCS World and the A10 add-on for that. And if you, in case you're wondering about the aeroplanes that you can see on the airfield, you can see a Curtiss Commando C-46 there. I've added that myself. So if you've seen a few weird planes like that, Curtiss Commando, on my airfield, these are things that I've added in manually. They're like FSX aeroplanes that I've put in. So there you go, the A10 Thunderbolt. Oh, one last thing. No pilot modelled in the cockpit, which is a little bit weird, and that's another thing that is the case on their A4 Skyhawk as well. As I say, if you've not seen that A4 Skyhawk review, that's on this channel as well. It's from the same developer, MScenery. They don't need to up their game that much. They just need to sort of tweak things a little bit. It's just little stuff like that, light being below where it should be, the ailerons not being animated particularly well, the wheel animations being a bit iffy. Stick a pilot in the thing, and maybe get someone in who's a bit better at tweaking flight models, or have a play around with the flight models, because the flight model on this is, the hood needs to work on this thing, because it's a low level plane and you really need a hood on that. So yeah, a few things. If you can live with those, go for it. If not, take a look at DCS World and the A10 Thunderbolt for that. That's it for now for Chock's Hangar. Got another video coming up soon of a standalone simulator, which you may or may not have heard of. That'll be uploaded a little bit later on after this one. But in the meantime, take care and have fun, everyone, and stick your comments in the section below, and you know, tell me I don't know what I'm talking about, or fantastic review, or whatever. But whatever you do, click that subscribe button and the notification bell, so that if you like my reviews, you'll get a notification for them. Anyway, that's it for now, and that's the channel plug. Anyway, take care, everyone. Bye.